Have tabletop role-playing games peaked? Or, as potentially a better question, can tabletop role-playing games peak? Now, I want to preface by saying this is not a scientific video. I'm not going to be comparing metrics of popularity of the genre, of different systems within the genre, or even anything of the like. I'm more so talking about the idea that obviously tabletop role-playing games are as big as they have ever been, especially with lockdown a few years back and the explosion of online role-playing sessions. More people are playing D&D, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, or whatever you prefer, more than ever before, ever since the introduction of role-playing games. What used to be a really niche hobby only played by a very small subsect of people is now pretty much normalized and played by a pretty large percentage of the world population, at least in comparison to what it used to be. It's obviously nothing close to the video game tyrant or things like that, but compared to where role-playing was even 10 years ago, the change is astronomical. So I guess the question is this astronomical growth going to continue, or will it subside, or has it already subsided? And a sort of tangential question alongside that is whether or not the quality of these games is going to increase with their popularity. Well, I suppose we should take this roughly one question at a time, and I guess the good place to start is the quality of these games. Are role-playing games now better presented and better written than their older counterpart? You'll notice I'm going to specifically avoid the word better because there's a lot of personal preference when it comes to what type of system is better, but there is something to be said for the quality and presentation of the material, which allows someone to both enter and enjoy it. Well, for one thing, in modern day, the rules for the biggest titans of the industry, D&D, Pathfinder, and a few others, are all available so easily. Back in the day, especially before the advent of the internet, you would have to find the rulebooks. You would have to probably go to a local game store, which I assume game stores were around in the 80s? You'd have to hope that a store somewhere near you had the book so you could buy it, or hope you had a friend who had the book. And I feel like that was a lot more of the regular back in the 80s and 90s. Everyone would gather at the one person's house who owned the books, and that person was also probably usually the dungeon master. Nowadays, everyone has access to everything, whether it's through Archives of Nethys, D&D Beyond, or whatever program you choose to use. Now, it's not always free, but it is always right at the click of a few buttons. Right now, even though I only own like 2 pieces of D&D 5e material, I could go online and buy the entire collection, hit charge, and I would have every piece of 5e official content within 10 minutes. Same goes for Pathfinder 2e. All the rules are for free, but if I wanted to get all of the adventures and everything Paizo's written, same idea. Go to Paizo.com, put it all in my cart, and I have it all right then and there. So just from an accessibility standpoint, I would say that RPGs are leagues ahead of where they used to be. Even compared to something like 2005 to 2010, you don't need to go to Newberry Comics to get your player's handbook anymore. You can just go either to D&D Beyond and get it right then and there, or go to Amazon and get it shipped to your door in 2 days. So that much is obvious, but also there's the question of the new player experience as well as the veteran experience. Are these new systems both welcoming to new players and engaging enough to veterans? And once again, this is going to be very, very opinionated on a case-by-case basis. Some people are going to say that 5e was perfect for them because it was their first system, it gave them just enough to work with, they weren't overwhelmed, and they can do whatever they want with it, which is great. But a lot of veterans think 5e is a little bit too simplistic, especially compared to 3rd edition preceding it. I know 4th edition existed, but I don't know anything about it, so I don't want to talk about it. So these people who wanted the crunch and wanted those numbers just didn't really get it out of 5th edition. But there's also something to talk about as well, and that is that these old systems still exist. D&D 3.5, Pathfinder 1st edition, hell, even D&D 4th edition still have active player bases, and you can still gain access to these system supplements and core rulebooks and everything even easier than you could when they were in their prime. You know, when 3.5 was in its prime, you still probably needed to get the player's handbook from your local game store, whereas now you can find it online. For that reason, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the amount of people, stay with me, if the amount of people playing 3.5 right now is actually equal to or more people than it was 20 years ago. Now, percentage-wise, it is obviously much lower. A lot of people move on to the newest system. You know, if you're talking about D&D, chances are you are talking about 5th edition. But 3.5 still has its diehard fans, and I'm sure there are people every day who are looking into it and are finding that it is the system for them. So once again, not only are the new systems accessible to everybody, but the old systems are more accessible than they used to be. So people can truly find the perfect system for them. If they want something super bare bones, D&D First Edition, the rules are out there. You can get the Rules Cyclopedia, which is technically like D&D 1.5, but you can get that. 5 minutes, go to DriveThruRPG, hit pay, you've got the Rules Cyclopedia from the 80s, and you can play as an elf. Not the race, the class elf. And then there's the representation. You know, the first really big one for the mainstream of tabletop role-playing game was probably Stranger Things. You know, that season 1 where, oh, look at these 13-year-olds in the 80s playing Dungeons and Dragons, wow. And that's what made a lot of people curious, especially because we live in an era of binging TV shows. You know, people watched the entirety of season 1, where D&D was a pretty decent factor in the entire story, to the point where it got them interested. You know, if they watched one episode a week, maybe it would never be enough to push them over that edge to start researching D&D, but Stranger Things, also coupled with the very soon pandemic leading to lockdown, was kind of a perfect storm to let people research role-playing games. And one of the first things that these people were usually pulled to was Critical Role. Now, your stance on Critical Role could be positive, could be negative, could be neutral, doesn't matter. You cannot deny the pop culture impact Critical Role had. We now had an actual watchable experience of how people play Dungeons and Dragons. You know, you watch Stranger Things, you watch Futurama, you might see them play D&D here and there, but it's not real D&D. You know, it's scripted, it's performed, which there's arguments for Critical Role, but it's a very different type. You know, this is a script. Critical Role is much more like a bullet point of stuff that is planned to happen. You know, much like a campaign. So with Stranger Things, with Critical Role, with the global lockdown, TTRPGs just had this amazing springboard into the mainstream, and with that came so many new people, so many people playing for the first time, so many people on Twitter saying they're DMing for the first time ever in 2020 and looking for advice, and seeing so many cool people come together and give them cool advice. You know, some of it could be a bit overwhelming, a bit ambitious, but, you know, it was just awesome. The TTRPG community came together, and it was really, really wholesome to see all of it jumping out into the mainstream and seeing it become so much more publicly available is the wrong word, but available. You know, I'm not just talking the material, but the genre, the medium of the role-playing game became much more publicly available. What was once just called Dungeons and Dragons, which was that basement game for nerds, was suddenly much more understood as a collaborative, cooperative storytelling experience. And from there, once people experienced D&D 5e, which was a perfect level of complexity for a new player, they could start looking elsewhere. I know tons of people who started D&D back in like 2018, 2019, and have since moved on to things like Pathfinder 2e in modern day because they wanted it to be a little more complicated. They might have moved on to Call of Cthulhu to have more relevant elements of mechanics to tell a horror, an eldritch story. Maybe they actually found D&D 5e too complicated, which is completely fine, so they found something like FateCore or what is it, Kids on Bikes, Monster of the Week. Those ones are a little bit more simple than D&D 5e and much more focused on the storytelling. A lot of people might not even have found D&D 5e too complicated. They just might have found the mechanics and the feats and the level progression and all of that to just be not fun. So a bunch of these other indie RPGs got a nice spotlight on them when people realized, hey, there are other games. Dungeons and Dragons didn't just mean Dungeons and Dragons. And that's when they learned that there was a whole TTRPG world out there, leading to that huge community boom. And of course, with that boom, there has come a lot of arguments, system superiority, and what have you, but that's just the nature of the beast. You know, you look at the console wars of the 90s, you look at Marvel versus DC, anything with even slightly competing IPs will have a system war, as it were. And it's unfortunate, but it's also a sign of growth. And I think that's really, really cool. You know, it's not necessarily positive growth, but being an unavoidable bump in the road, it shows that TTRPGs are so much bigger than they were before. You know, back in 2014, you might have seen, oh, we fight over 5e versus 3.5, but now you see people arguing 5e, 2e, 3.5, Call of Cthulhu, Shadowrun, Delta Green, others, 7th Sea, I don't know, I'm bad on the spot. Monster of the Week, Kids on Bikes, Savage Worlds, they're all, the Starfinder, there's so many out there, and the fact that people are talking about so many games, and it's so easy to find people talking about your game is incredible. We're circling all the way back around to the accessibility of the genre, which is that people now have access to other people. Now, if you're 15, 16 years old and trying to get into D&D, if no one at your school plays, you might not be out of luck. You might be able to find an organized play on Pathfinder Society or an Adventurers League at a local game store or something like that because the internet has connected all of us. So what used to be a hobby that could only be shared with those who lived close to you, or maybe if you were in college, you happened to be in the same dorm, you could run a campaign. Now, you can play online, and then there's all of the Roll20, the Foundry, the Fantasy Grounds, everything you can use to augment that online experience, which has been getting better and better every year, especially in the past 2 years, making the entire online experience more streamlined, more customizable. You know, on Foundry, you can customize your own digital dice, you can do lighting and sound effects whenever you cast certain spells. The online RPG scene has evolved in the last 2 years, and it's so cool to see. And it's not for everyone. You know, I still miss and prefer playing in person, but I know people, some personal friends of mine, who spend hours every day making macros, making maps, making super cool stuff that when their players get to that section, they can press a button and on the map, it looks like a live fire comes to life in the cauldron and emits a glow that has a built-in lighting effect with a music cue and sound effect. And they're so proud of it, and it augments their entire experience, and their group loves it, and it's a whole new dynamic to tabletop role-playing games that didn't exist 5 years ago. And it's so cool that something that's been around for 50 years now is still having these moments, these shifts in evolution where some whole new aspect comes to the table. No pun intended. So have tabletop role-playing games peaked? Is this the limit? Like, the obvious answer is no. The games are still being made, content is still being put out, new people are still joining every day. Foundry and Roll20, well, Foundry is updating daily, adding new modules, new everything. I don't think we've peaked. But there is obviously the fact that the world is returning to normal. People are back at work, people are back to their Monday through Friday, lockdown is over, free time is a lot less common again, similar to pre-lockdown. And because of that, people might not have the time to dive into these games anymore. A lot of them, luckily, were able to spend those hours of free times while their jobs weren't safe. They were able to study the rulebook, learn how to dungeon master, learn how to make characters, learn how to play Call of Cthulhu. But now that their free time is restricted by their in-office job hours again, I'm curious if we're going to see a fall-off in players. I definitely won't be surprised whatsoever if, the Roll20 and Foundry analytics show a very large chunk of lost player base in the next 2 years. But I think we can look past that at the alternative, which I think is very likely. A lot of those lost players are still going to be playing. They're just going to be playing in person now that they and their friends have had a chance to learn and engage with the tabletop experience, and now they can play it in person. They can actually get the authentic old school feeling of actually playing at a table with miniatures and clickety-clack math rocks, because online dice don't have that satisfying chuckle. So no, I do not believe TTRPGs have peaked. However, I don't know where we're going from here. Now that we've had the ability to completely augment our online games to have these sound effects and lighting cues and macros, how does that evolution translate to the table? Well, there are a lot of cool products coming out. I'm not sponsored by any of them. I think one's called Game Board, and a lot of others are trying to make these really fancy tabletops. I mean, some companies are actually selling digital gaming tables, which are like a computer and a screen built into your gaming table, so you can load up like an online map onto your physical table and like put minis on it and move around. So you're playing in person, but you've still got the power of these virtual tabletops right in front of you. So I think that's the next evolution in the next few years. I think we're going to see all of these revelations and advancements in online tabletops find a way to come to the physical tabletop to give that level of advanced gameplay. The question is, how expensive is that gonna be? But that's a question for another day, because that is about 20 minutes of rambling. But let me know what you think. Do you think TTRPGs have peaked? Do you think they peaked back in the 2000s, the 90s? Do you think AD&D was the top of the line, the best time to play the game? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing from you, even if some of you are very aggressive. Thank you so much for watching. Huge shout out to my patrons for helping keep the channel alive. If you would like to support the channel, there is a link in the description to my Patreon where you can get your name on this ever-growing list. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And until next time, no nat ones.